Hey everyone, my name's Doc, and for those that may not know me, I've been making healing builds for the Elder Scrolls Online for a little while now. And even though subclassing has been out for a good bit now, I know that some people still appreciate a good pure class healer. I thought it might be convenient for some people to go back and put every individual build together in one long mega video. This video will cover all of my old pure class healing builds prior to update 46, and while some of them might be slightly out of date as of today or the time you're watching this video, nearly everything in those builds is still perfectly viable in a lot of content. If you've been enjoying subclassing like I have though, I've got those builds linked in the description for you as well. So let's get right into this. A while back, I made a build video covering the meta healing build for both Trials and non-Trials content in the Elder Scrolls Online. While I was and still am pretty proud of that video, I think I didn't get to do each individual build the justice that it deserves. So over the next week or so, I'm making a little 3-part mini-series called Healer Build Breakdown, where I'll be doing a deep dive into those meta healer builds. My goal is not just to give you the what, but the why as well. The explanations in this video will assume that you've got little to no healing experience, so if there are any veteran healers watching, this will probably just be a refresher for you guys. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video, we'll be covering the dungeon build. Let's go ahead and get into this. So when I first published the original build video, I had referred to this as the non-trials build, which I think may have been a tad misleading, and I do apologize for that. One of the recommended sets for this build is still from a trial, though I do have an alternative this time around, but the reason I call it the non-trial build is because the build itself is made for any PvE content that isn't a trial. So think dungeons, arenas, overland, etc. The main goal of this build is to maintain a high major courage uptime, giving your party some extra weapon and spell damage. Then, during boss encounters, you give your party a huge burst of increased damage through Major Slayer and Major Force. Because it is a dungeon build, we won't need quite as much healing, though I wouldn't say that this hybrid build will certainly still be almost pure healer because this build is made with Vet HM dungeons in mind. It's just that we'll contribute a little bit more to team damage and debuffing than on a Trials build. So let's start with the basics. For our race, I pretty much exclusively use Bretons for my healers. Their increased magicka regen and decreased spell cost can be pretty substantial in boosting our sustain without having to change anything about our actual build. Of course, though, race isn't tremendously important, so if you don't care for Bretons, you're wrong, but other good races include Argonians, High Elves, Dark Elves, and Khajiit. When it comes to class, I'll be demonstrating this on my Templar, and I'll be sharing the details with Templar in mind. However, this build can work on all classes, so if you don't care for Templar or you don't want to make one, then feel free to use whichever class you enjoy the most. The main reason I'll be using my Templar is just that it's my main and it's what I enjoy using the most. So, if you need to swap out some class skills whenever we get to that section, please go right ahead. So for our attributes, you're going to want all 64 into Magicka for the heal/damage scaling and resource management. For our Mundus, you have a few options. I personally use the Atronach for some extra Magicka recovery in dungeons because I find that in a dungeon setting, especially on a Templar, that sustain is a little more difficult to manage, and we really don't need the extra healing. Of course, though, the Ritual Mundus for the extra healing and the Thief Mundus for some extra crit damage and healing are also fantastic options. For our food, I generally prefer foods that affect both our health and our magicka. In an ideal world, you shouldn't need the extra health, but having that extra health gives you a safety net in case things go sideways. To achieve this, we'll want to use the Clockwork Citrus Fillet, found from completing Brengolin's questline in the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge. It provides us with an increase to our max health and magicka, as well as an increase to our health and magicka recovery. I will say though that even though Clockwork Citrus Fillet is easy to get, it is pretty costly to make, needing a perfect row to make this, which those are not super easy to come by. This is why I generally use the Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. You can buy it from guild traders, so it's easy to acquire, and the only ingredient that you may need to go out of your way for is some nightshade, which isn't too hard to come by. It gives similar stat bonuses to the citrus fillet, even if it isn't quite as strong. For potions, I usually end up using Tri-Stat or just some simple Magicka potions. You could run heroism potions if you really feel inclined, but I find that dungeon bosses are spaced far enough apart, and fights typically don't last long enough for you to really benefit from heroism potions. I'd recommend saving your heroism potions for some trials instead. Up next, we'll talk about champion points. For our blue CP tree, you'll want From the Brink. This will give your allies a huge damage shield if they fall below 25% health while you're healing them. Ideally, you'll have some sort of heal over time constantly ticking away, so they should get the shield pretty much instantly. I pulled off plenty of clutch saves with this whenever something goes wrong, and I highly recommend it. Next is Swift Renewal. This increases the amount of healing that your heal over time spells do. This is a great perk to have because, like we mentioned previously, you'll want to have a heal over time spell active throughout the fight, meaning this will be one of your main sources of constant passive healing on your teammates. Increasing the amount of healing that these can do can help keep teammates topped off without needing to rely on burst heals. Next is Soothing Tide. This increases the amount of healing your area of effect heals do. You'll want this perk for pretty much the exact same reason as Swift Renewal. AoE heals are constant, passive healing that helps your healing be a bit more proactive than reactive. With both heal over time spells and area of effect spells constantly healing your teammates, you can place your focus on other things like buffs, debuffs, or mechanics. And number 4 is Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. This will sort of just depend on your personal preference because they're both fantastic options. Enlivening Overflow will grant you and or your team a pretty generous amount of recovery to all 3 resources when you're overhealing. And Hope Infusion will grant minor heroism, generating some ultimate for you and or your team whenever you heal someone below 50% health. I personally tend to go for Enlivening Overflow, especially in a dungeon setting, because I find that you're overhealing much more often than you're healing someone below 50%. Though, if you enjoy Hope Infusion, it is absolutely worth running. For our red CP tree, you'll want Boundless Vitality. You can't heal people if you're laying on the ground. This will give you some extra health as a cushion in case things go sideways. It's especially useful if you're a Warden, since they can apply the buff Minor Toughness, which will increase your max health, and that buff is percentage-based. Warden Healers can have a pretty sizable health pool without losing out on any of the good healing tools. Next is Fortified. Very similar to the last perk, Fortified will increase our survivability by giving us some extra armor. Like I mentioned before, a dead healer isn't healing anyone, so between Boundless Vitality, Fortified, and your healing, you should be pretty hard to put down. Next is Rejuvenation. This will give you some extra Magicka health and stamina recovery. While stamina and health recovery aren't super important for healers, they're certainly nice to have. The Magicka recovery is great for healers though, as this is another example of some small sustain bonus that we can add without losing out on any of our healing tools. And lastly, it's a flex spot. There are several options here that you can use depending on a few things. By default, I usually run Celerity or Spirit Mastery. Celerity will increase our movement speed, making it easier to not stand in things that are bad for our health. Spirit Mastery will increase your revive speed, and while healers are normally not the ones going for reses, sometimes a healer can actually be in a very good spot to go for a res. If you're a Templar, this is even better, since Templars already get a revive speed increase passive skill. Man, that was kind of a mouthful. Revive speed increase passive skill. Oh my gosh. All right. Otherwise, if you're running something that has a lot of crowd control, Slippery or Expert Evasion are also fantastic options. For our green CP tree, it honestly doesn't matter. You can just run whatever you feel like. A lot of these slottables are going to change with Update 45, and very few of them actually affect combat anyway. Next, let's talk about skills. Before I actually explain each individual skill, please keep in mind that for this build, I will be using my Templar, so the skills will be reflective of that. Again though, you can absolutely run this build on any class. Like I said before, you'll just need to swap out the class skills with skills from your own class. If you need any recommendations for those, please feel free to leave them down in the comments. Okay, let's talk about skills. In our Restoration Staff front bar, we will start with Purifying Light. This Dawn's Wrath skill is a nice little burst of damage with a decent heal after it ends, though the main reason we'll be using it is to proc our class passive Minor Sorcery, which increases you and your party spell damage by 10%. Next is Combat Prayer. The healer's bread and butter, found in the Restoration Staff skill line, this will be our main spammable. It grants anyone it hits a burst of healing, minor berserk, and minor resolve, meaning this skill is a heal, a damage boost, and a defensive buff all in one single skill that can hit multiple people. Next is Healing Springs. Found in the Restoration Staff skill line, this is a solid AoE heal by itself, but for this build specifically, it's actually being used in conjunction with the Master's Restoration Staff to grant some extra resources to teammates. We'll talk more about it in just a minute. I like Springs for the extra recovery, though if you wanted to use the other morph of the skill, that is also totally fine. Either one, it's just up to your preference. Next is Luminous Shards. Typically, this is where we would have Energy Orb from the Undaunted skill line if we were on another class. But for Templars, this is a decent damage Adric Spear skill that provides a solid resource restoration synergy. The reason we don't use both this and Orb is because that synergy shares a cooldown. And since we want to contribute a little more to damage in dungeon settings, this is the perfect skill to replace Energy Orb. Next is Radiating Regeneration, a fantastic heal over time skill from the Restoration Staff skill line that will help keep our teammates topped off and continuously proc Spell Power Cure. Since Spell Power Cure relies on overhealing, you'll refresh the Major Courage buff, which will increase the team's weapon and spell damage with every tick of this skill. And for our front bar ultimate, we have Reviving Barrier. We're not typically going to be casting this Alliance War skill, but it can still be useful in a pinch if the encounter starts going sideways. The main reason we have it is for the Magicka Aid support line passive, which will give us an extra 10% Magicka recovery just for having this ability slotted. On our Destruction Staff back bar, we will have Destructive Reach. This Destruction Staff skill is a spammable, a damage over time, and an elemental debuff all in one. It's not the best at any of those things, but it's a nice way to debuff the boss for your team and do a little extra damage yourself. Next is Elemental Blockade, and the main reason that we're almost always going to have this Destruction Staff skill on our back bar is so that we can proc our back bar enchantment. There's also a chance that it can apply an elemental debuff to an enemy as well. Next is Extended Ritual, a fantastic Restoring Light AoE heal that has a large range for times when your party might be a bit spread out. In a dungeon setting, I don't typically find a lot of use for the Cleanse synergy, but it is still really nice to have nonetheless. Next is Overflowing Altar. This Undaunted skill will apply minor lifesteal to all enemies in its pretty generous range, which will essentially act as another heal over time for your team. Of course, the synergy is also fantastic for tanks, helping them restore 65% of their max health. It also helps that this skill costs health instead of magicka, meaning it's very low cost in the long run. Next is Echoing Vigor, another fantastic heal over time skill that costs stamina instead of magicka. This skill from the Assault Alliance War skill line, like Radiating Regeneration, will help keep our teammates topped off and contribute to Major Courage uptime. And finally, for our back bar ultimate, we have Aggressive Warhorn. Now this is the ult we're going to cast. When you cast this ultimate from the Assault Alliance War skill line, all teammates in a pretty generous range will receive a 10% increase to their max magicka and max stamina for 30 seconds, as well as gaining Major Force, which will increase critical damage by 20% for 10 seconds. And finally, we are going to talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. First, we'll talk about our front bar set, or in other words, this will be the main set that you wear in your chest, hands, legs, shoes, and belt spots. The goal is to have this set be active at all times, and you'll generally want it to be a set that has a very low cooldown or requires a very high uptime. In these spots, you'll want to have Spell Power Cure. Found in the White Gold Tower dungeon, this set will provide your teammates with major courage whenever you overheal them, which gives you and your allies a hefty weapon and spell damage buff. It's arguably one of, if not the best support set in the game, and it's also very easy to farm, as White Gold Tower is honestly pretty easy these days. The weight will be light because the set is only available in light, but that's okay because light armor is best for healers anyway. For the enchantments, we'll want all max magicka for the extra sustain and scaling. For the traits, we'll want Divines, which will increase our Mundus Stone's effectiveness, though I will say if you want to do this, I also enjoy using the Infused trait for big pieces, and when I say big pieces, I mean the pieces that have a higher enchantment scaling. Like for example, you can put the same max magicka enchantment on a chest and a belt, but the chest will yield more magicka. Putting the Infused trait on these pieces will result in making these big pieces give you even more max magicka. Next, we'll have our back bar set, or in other words, this will be your backup set that you'll want in your jewelry and secondary weapon slot. This is usually reserved for a set that does have a pretty high cooldown or that you only need to activate once in a while. The reason being is that if you're using a mythic item or an arena weapon, you won't be able to have both 5-piece sets active at all times. So you'll have one set that will only activate when you swap to your back bar, hence the name back bar set. In this spot, you'll want Master Architect. Found in the Halls of Fabrication Trial, this set will provide you and your allies with a pretty long duration of the Major Slayer buff when you cast your ultimate, which will increase damage done to group content monsters by 10%. Pairing it with the Warhorn skill that we previously mentioned will give your allies a serious damage boost. For our jewelry, we'll want the Arcane trait to increase our max magicka, and enchantments are usually either recovery or spell damage, or sometimes a combination of the two. You can kind of just feel out what works best for you. As your secondary weapon, you'll of course want a Destruction Staff, which will have the Infused trait with either the Crushing or Berserker enchantment. If you're curious as to which element you should use, it honestly doesn't really matter that much, but I do have a video on my channel going over that if you're interested. Now, I do understand that not everyone can or wants to run trials, so I'd like to offer an alternative here. If you prefer, you can always use Powerful Assault in your back bar spot, casting a skill from the Assault skill line, so in this case, Echoing Vigor, will give you and your allies a buff to weapon and spell damage that is smaller than Spell Power Cure, but these sets do stack. You can find Powerful Assault by purchasing it with the Telvar currency in the Imperial City, or you can buy it from guild traders. It is a little bit expensive, especially the Ice Staff, but it is worth it in my opinion. You can always get the Lightning Staff instead of the Ice Staff if you want to save a little bit of gold. Traits and enchantments of everything will all stay the same regardless of which of these two sets you choose to use for your back bar. Next, we'll move on to our monster set. A monster set is a 2-piece set that is only available in the head and shoulder spot. You'll find the headpiece from completing the corresponding veteran dungeon, and you can buy the shoulder pieces from the Undaunted Enclave using Undaunted keys. For our monster spots, I like to use Nazare, which is found in the Vet Shipwright's Regret dungeon. This set will increase the duration of debuffs applied to enemies whenever you cast your ultimate. So, as you can tell, there's a little bit of a theme in this. Pairing this set with Master Architect and Warhorn makes an already powerful ultimate combination even stronger. For the weight, I like to go with 1 medium and 1 heavy. The reason is that there is a passive skill in the Undaunted skill line that gives you extra health, magicka, and stamina whenever you have at least 1 kind of each armor weight. This improves our survivability, gives us better sustain through a higher resource pool, and makes a lot of our spells even better, since a lot of them partially scale off maximum resources. Now, there are a lot of people who will swear by 6 light and 1 medium, or just 7 light. I personally still prefer the 5-1-1, but you can make that judgment call yourself. Finally, we have our arena weapon or mythic item, and in this case, it will be a restoration staff that we'll have as our primary weapon. That weapon is going to be the Master's Restoration Staff, sometimes called Grand Rejuvenation. Found in Dragonstar Arena, it gives extra stamina and magicka recovery to anyone who's hit by the initial cast of the Grand Healing skill. Since this will be your front bar weapon, you'll want to have the powered trait, which increases our healing, and you can use whatever enchantment you feel like. I personally tend to go with either absorb magicka or weapon damage, but honestly, it really doesn't matter. Welcome back to our second episode of Healer Build Breakdown, where I'll be doing a deep dive into ESO's meta healer builds. My goal is to give you not just the what, but the where and the why we do the things the way that we do. Since this build is a bit more endgame focused, we will assume that you have a little bit of healing experience by now. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video we'll be covering the Yorvold's Guidance Roaring Opportunist build, otherwise known as Rojo. Let's go ahead and get into this. So the goal of the Rojo build is dedicated almost entirely to keeping a high uptime on the Roaring Opportunist set. When you complete a fully charged heavy attack, Roaring Opportunist will provide a buff to 6 players known as Major Slayer, which increases all damage done to group content monsters by 10%. So if you complete 2 fully charged heavy attacks, you can give Major Slayer to an entire Trials team. The only problem is that Roaring Opportunist has a maximum duration of 12 seconds, and players can only receive the buff every 22 seconds. Well, that's where our other set, Yorvold's Guidance, comes into play. This will extend the duration of major and minor buffs and debuffs, allowing for a much higher uptime on Major Slayer, which will give the team a massive increase in damage. I'll explain more in depth whenever we get to our sets section, but for now, just know that the goal of this build is to keep a high uptime on Major Slayer. So for our race, I pretty much exclusively use Bretons, no change there from the previous video. They give us a pretty good boost to our sustain without having to change anything with our build. Of course though, like we always mention, race isn't super important, so if you don't care for Bretons, you can use an Argonian, High Elf, Dark Elf, Khajiit, those are all good choices too. When it comes to class, ideally you'll want to be on a Warden. Technically, this build can work on pretty much any class, but Warden just is the best healing class in the game at the moment. It offers a ton of defensive buffs, very high healing output, and great sustain options. For attributes, like always, you'll want 64 into Magicka for the heal and damage scaling and some resource management. For our Mundus, you have a couple options. I personally use the Ritual for the extra healing with this build, because since Roaring Opportunist requires you to heavy attack, you probably won't really have many issues with sustain. Of course though, if you do feel like you're having issues with sustain, the Atronach Mundus for some extra magicka recovery is also a good option. For our food, much like last time, we'll want to use the Clockwork Citrus Fillet, found from completing Brengolin's questline in the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge. It's going to provide us with some max health and magicka, as well as some health and magicka recovery. Like last time though, Clockwork Citrus Fillet, despite being easy to get, is pretty costly to make, requiring a perfect row. This is why I generally use the Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. You can buy it from guild traders, so easy to acquire. The only ingredient you really may need to go out of your way for is some Nightshade, and that shouldn't be too difficult. It does give similar stat bonuses to the Citrus Fillet, even if it isn't quite as strong. For potions, I'd recommend running some Heroism potions to get extra ultimate generation. Though for this build in particular, there's nothing really wrong if you just want to bring some Tri-Stat or some Magicka potions or something like that. Up next, we'll talk about champion points, and those will be the exact same as the other builds, but I'll go ahead and re-explain these in case this is the first part that you happen to see. For our blue CP tree, you will want From the Brink, which will give your allies a huge damage shield if they fall below 25%. Swift Renewal, which will increase the amount of healing that your heal over time spells do. Of course, we always want to have a heal over time active, so it's great to have this. Soothing Tide increases the amount of healing your AoE heals do. And much like our heal over time spells, you'll pretty much always want to have an AoE heal down at some point. And finally, you can use either Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. Ideally, you'll want one healer running Overflow and one running Infusion. I generally prefer Overflow for this build, especially because, typically the Warden Healer for the Rojo build is going to be the group healer, so chances are you're going to be doing a lot more overhealing. Either way, though, you can run whichever you want, whether it's Hope Infusion or Enlivening Overflow. I would just recommend, try to make sure that one healer's running one healer's running another. Just coordinate with your other healer. If there's a little bit of overlap, it's not the end of the world, but, just wanted to put that out there. For our red CP, you'll want a Boundless Vitality. Again, like we mentioned last time, you can't heal people if you're floor parsing. So this will give you some extra health as a cushion in case things go wrong. Fortified, just like our last perk, Fortified will increase some survivability, gives us a little bit of extra armor. Rejuvenation, extra magicka, health, and stamina recovery. These things are always nice, just a little extra bonus to our recovery without having to change anything about our build. And finally, our flex spot. A lot of people will run Celerity, Spirit Mastery, depending on the content that you're getting into. Slippery or Expert Evasion are also fantastic options to use here. It's kind of just whatever you feel like, just depends on, what works best for you. And for our green CP tree, like we always mention, it does not matter. You can run whatever you feel like because a lot of these slottables are going to change with update 45 anyway, and not a whole lot of them really do anything for combat, so, run whatever you feel like. Okay, and next let's talk about skills. So before I explain each individual skill, just remember that for this build, the ideal choice will be a Warden, so our skills will be reflective of that. Again, you can run this build on any class, but if you are running something other than a Warden, just remember you will need to change out the class skills with something from your own class. As always, if you need any recommendations for those, please feel free to leave them down in the comments and I will happily answer any questions. Okay, let's go ahead and talk about skills. So on our Restoration Staff front bar, we are going to start with Enchanted Growth. So this is a decent burst heal, but the main reason that we're running this is because anyone you hit with this ability will gain Minor Endurance and Minor Intellect for 20 seconds, increasing their stamina and magicka recovery by 15% respectively. Number 2, Combat Prayer, one of the best healing skills in the game. It'll be our main spammable. It grants everyone who it hits a burst of healing, Minor Berserk, and Minor Resolve. Number 3, Healing Springs. Solid AoE heal by itself, but we are going to be using the Master's Restoration Staff for this build, so this ability will help you grant some extra recovery to your teammates. Number 4, Energy Orb, a slow-moving but very good AoE heal that can really contribute during a heal check. But the nicest thing about this is actually its synergy, which can restore a hefty amount of magicka or stamina, making it really useful to throw at your tanks. Number 5, Radiating Regeneration, a fantastic heal over time skill. It'll help keep our teammates topped off while we can focus on things like our heavy attacks. And for our ultimate for our front bar, Reviving Barrier. So this is a great shield heal hybrid that can be useful in a pinch if the encounter starts going sideways. Though, the main reason that we have it is for the Magicka Aid passive, which will give us an extra 10% magicka recovery just for having this slotted. And on our Destruction Staff back bar, we are going to start with Expansive Frost Cloak. So this skill offers a fantastic buff to the whole team by providing everyone in its large radius Major Resolve, which will increase physical and spell resistances by a pretty large amount for 20 seconds. Next is Elemental Blockade, and the main reason that we're going to have this on our back bar is so that we can proc our back bar enchantment, and there's also a chance that it applies an elemental debuff to an enemy as well, which Chilled on Warden is actually even better, so highly recommend bringing an Ice Staff. Next is Budding Seeds. So this is an AoE heal and a burst heal in one skill, With a heal over time synergy too, this is an extremely versatile tool for Warden Healers that can offer fantastic healing in nearly every scenario. Next is Overflowing Altar, and this will apply minor lifesteal to all enemies in its pretty generous range, which will basically just be another small heal over time for your team. Of course, the synergy is also fantastic, restoring 65% of your max health, so very useful for tanks. One last thing that I'll mention with Overflowing Altar, though, is that you only need one healer to have this active at a time. So if two healers are running it, one of y'all isn't really getting value out of it. So just coordinate with your fellow healer to see if maybe one of you wants to swap this out for something else. Next is Echoing Vigor, which is another fantastic heal over time skill that costs stamina instead of magicka, and like Radiating Regeneration, it'll help keep our teammates topped off. And finally, our backbar ultimate, Aggressive Warhorn. When you cast this ability, all teammates in a pretty generous range will receive a 10% increase to their max magicka and stamina for 30 seconds. During this time, they'll also gain Major Force, which will increase their critical damage by a whopping 20% for 10 seconds. Of course, this all will actually last a little bit longer since we're running Yorvold's Guidance, which will increase the amount of time that these things are active for. Okay, and finally we'll talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. First, we'll talk about our front bar set, or in other words, our main set that will make up most of our body pieces. In these spots, you'll want to have Yorvold's Guidance. Found in the Scalecaller Peak dungeon, this set will extend the duration of major and minor buffs and debuffs, which, like we mentioned, is meant to increase our backbar set's uptime, but can also be really useful in just every skill that we cast. It isn't the easiest farm in the world. Scalecaller can take a little while, but it is very doable. The weight will be light because it's only available in light, but that's okay. For the enchantments, we'll want all max magicka for the extra sustain and scaling. For the trait, the best choice will be Divines, which will increase our Mundus Stone effectiveness, though I always advocate for it. I do enjoy using Infused on the big pieces, meaning the armor that has a higher defense and enchantment scaling. Just if you want your build to be a little more well-rounded, I do think Divines is probably objectively the best choice. I don't know. I just still really like Infused for the big pieces. That's just my preference. Next, we'll have our back bar set, or in other words, our backup set that we'll want in our jewelry and secondary weapon slot. In this spot, we'll want Roaring Opportunist. Found in the Kind's Aegis trial, this set will provide up to 6 people in your party with Major Slayer when you complete a fully charged heavy attack. This will increase the damage done to group content monsters by 10%. So like we mentioned earlier, completing 2 fully charged heavy attacks will grant Major Slayer to your entire raid team. For our jewelry, we'll want the Arcane trait to increase our max magicka, and enchantments are usually spell damage, sometimes recovery. I think spell damage is probably the better option for this build in particular. Our Destruction Staff will want to have the Infused trait with either the Crushing or the Weakening enchantment. For this build in particular, in terms of the element, I actually do recommend using an Ice Staff because Wardens get a lot of benefits whenever they use Ice Staff, especially, doing something like proccing Chilled or stuff like that. So I would recommend an Ice Staff, but of course, if you use a Lightning or Inferno, it's not the end of the world either. And next, we'll move on to our 2-piece monster set. So remember that you'll find the headpiece from the monster set's Veteran Dungeon, and you can buy the shoulder pieces from the Undaunted Enclave. For our monster set, I like to use Ozazen the Inferno, which is found in Vet Scrivener's Hall. This set will give you and your team some extra armor when you overheal them, and it will give them minor vitality, which will increase the healing and damage shield strength they receive whenever you aren't overhealing them. It's a fantastic defense set that gives you and your team just a little bit more room for error. For the weight, I like to go with 1 medium and 1 heavy for the Undaunted passive that will give us some extra resources to work with. And finally, we have our arena weapon or mythic item. Now personally, I like to use the Master's Restoration Staff, sometimes called Grand Rejuvenation, as our primary weapon. This is found in the Dragonstar Arena, and it gives some extra stamina and magicka recovery to anyone who's hit by the initial cast of either morph of the Grand Healing skill. You'll want this to have the powered trait, which increases our healing, and you can use whatever enchantment you feel like. Personally, I tend to go with either Absorb Magicka or Weapon Damage, but honestly, doesn't really matter, whichever one you want. Welcome back to our third and final episode of Healer Build Breakdown, where I'll be doing a deep dive into ESO's meta healer builds. My goal is not just to give you the what, but the where and the why we do the things the way that we do. Since this is a pretty advanced build, we will assume you have a good bit of healing experience when we explain these things. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video we'll be covering the Spell Power Cure Pillager's Prophet build, otherwise known as the Ulti-Gen build. So let's just go ahead and get right into this. So the goal of the Ulti-Gen build is not only to generate a ton of ultimate charge for yourself, but also to generate a ton of ultimate charge for your teammates as well. Spell Power Cure doesn't really affect our ultimate charge that much, but it's the best support set in the game, in my opinion, so Spell Power Cure is here to stay. Our actual main ultimate generation comes from the Nightblade class and the Pearls of Elnafay Mythic, which will give us a ton of charge very quickly. Keep in mind though that the Pearls of Elnafay only generate ultimate when your highest maximum resource is below 50%, so we'll talk about ways that we can make that easier as we go along. Then, Pillager's Prophet allows us to give some of that ultimate charge to our teammates whenever we cast our own ultimate, leading to constant ults and high Warhorn uptime. Don't worry, again, I'll explain more as we go along. For now, let's just talk about the specifics of the build. So, for race, like I always mention, I pretty much exclusively use Bretons for the sustain boost. However, since this build will want you to try to keep your sustain a little on the lower side, I can also recommend using other races like Argonians, High Elves, Dark Elves, and Khajiit. When it comes to class, ideally you'll want to be on a Nightblade. While this build can technically work on any class, the Nightblade's passives will give us a huge boost in ultimate generation, meaning this build will be a good bit weaker on other classes. For our attributes, you'll want all 64 into Magicka for the heal/damage scaling and resource management. For our Mundus, you have a few options. I personally use the Ritual for the extra healing, especially because the Pearls of Elnafay requires us to be below 50% Magicka. We're not really going to want to over-sustain or anything like that. Of course, though, if you do feel like you are really just super under-sustaining, the Atronach Mundus is available for you to use. So for our food, like we mentioned previously, I am usually going to prefer foods that affect both health and magicka. So, as always, we'll want the Clockwork Citrus Fillet found from completing Brengolin's questline in the Clockwork City Outlaws Refuge. Provides us with some max health, some max magicka, as well as an increase to our max health and magicka recovery. I will say though, again, like we always mention, it's easy to get, but costly to make. This is why I tend to use Witch Mother's Potent Brew instead. You can buy it from guild traders, so nice and easy to get. And the only ingredient that you may need to go a little out of your way to find is some Nightshade, and that's really not too hard to come by. It gives similar stat bonuses to the Citrus Fillet, even if it isn't quite as strong. Now I know we said we don't want to over-sustain, however, we also don't want to under-sustain as well. So I would still recommend some of these foods, even if they do give a little bit of extra magicka recovery, because, I mean, we do still need some magicka recovery, right? And for potions, I'd recommend running some heroism potions to get some extra ultimate generation. If you wanted to, you could use something like Tristat or Magicka or whatever, but in my opinion, heroism is definitely the best for this build. Up next, we'll talk about champion points, and those will be pretty much the exact same as other builds, but I'll go ahead and re-explain them in case this is the first part of the series you see. For our blue CP tree, you will want From the Brink. It will give our allies a huge damage shield if they fall below 25% while you're healing them. Ideally, you'll always have some sort of heal over time constantly ticking, so they should get the shield pretty much instantly, usually before they fall to 0% health. Next is Swift Renewal. This is going to increase the amount of healing that our heal over time spells do. Again, like we mentioned, we want to have a heal over time up pretty much at all times, so this will do the bulk of our healing for us so that we can focus on other things. Soothing Tide, this is going to increase the amount of healing that our AoE heals do, and you'll want this for pretty much the exact same reason as Swift Renewal. AoE heals are constant, passive healing that helps keep your healing be more proactive than reactive, and of course, both heal over time effects and AoE heals are going to be fantastic options for keeping spell power cure up. And then finally, Enlivening Overflow or Hope Infusion. And this will sort of just depend on team composition. Ideally, you'll want one healer on Overflow and one on Infusion. Enlivening Overflow will grant you and or your team a pretty generous amount of recovery to all 3 resources whenever they're being overhealed. And Hope Infusion will grant minor heroism, granting some ultimate for you and your team anytime you heal someone below 50%. I would just coordinate with the other healer, see what they're running. It doesn't really matter which of the 2 you run on whichever healer. For our red CP tree, you will want Boundless Vitality, and like we always mention, you cannot heal people if you are taking a dirt nap. This will give you some extra health as a cushion in case things go sideways. If you happen to be a Warden using this build, ideally you'll be on Nightblade, but if you happen to be on a Warden, this perk is even stronger since you also get the minor toughness buff from Wardens. Next is Fortified, and very similar to the last perk, Fortified will increase our survivability by giving us some extra armor. Like I mentioned before, a dead healer isn't a good healer. So between Boundless Vitality, Fortified, and your own healing, you should be pretty hard to put down. Next is Rejuvenation, and this will give you some extra magicka, health, and stamina recovery. While stamina and health recovery not super important for healers, it's nice to have, and the magicka recovery is great for healers. And even though that, again, right, we want to keep our recovery in a relatively low spot so that we can keep Pearls of Elnathay procced, Rejuvenation is not going to give us so much recovery that it's going to hurt the build. If anything, I think that it's a very nice sweet spot for the amount of recovery that we get. And then finally, we have our flex spot. Now, there are several options that you can run here depending on a few things. By default, I usually run Celerity or Spirit Mastery. Celerity will increase our movement speed, and Spirit Mastery will increase our revive speed. And while healers are not normally the ones going for reses, sometimes a healer can actually be in a really good spot to go for a res, especially in a trials setting where you have a second healer most of the time. If you happen to be a Templar running this build, this is even better since Templars already get a revive speed increase. Otherwise though, if you're running some sort of content that has a lot of crowd control, looking at you, Cloud Rest, Slippery or Expert Evasion are also fantastic options. And finally, for our green CP tree, like we always mention, it does not matter. You can run whatever you feel like. A lot of these slottables are going to change with update 45, and like we mentioned previously, very few of them actually affect combat. Okay, and next let's talk about skills. So before I actually explain each individual skill, like we've talked about previously in our Rojo build, ideally you'll be on a Nightblade for this class, so our skills will be reflective of that. Again though, you can run this build on any class, so if you're not on a Nightblade, you'll just need to swap out the class skills with skills from your own class. Of course though, the other skills, the Restoration Staff, Guild, Undaunted, whatever, right, those things will stay as they are. Okay, if you need any recommendations for those, if you happen to be playing another class, please don't hesitate to leave that comment down below, and I'll make sure to get back to you with my recommendations on an individual class level. Okay, let's actually talk about skills now. So, on our Restoration Staff front bar, we are going to start with Healthy Offering, a very strong single target heal that also grants you minor mending for 10 seconds, though I will say the biggest reason that we use this is for the transfer passive, which will give us a couple extra ultimate with a very short cooldown whenever we cast a siphoning skill. Next is Combat Prayer. If you're familiar with healing or the channel, then you will know Combat Prayer is on pretty much every healing build. It grants anyone it hits a burst of healing, Minor Berserk, and Minor Resolve. It's a fantastic skill. There's no reason not to have Combat Prayer on. Next is Healing Springs. This is a very strong AoE heal that can help contribute to your major courage up times. I use Springs because I find that the extra Magicka recovery doesn't really hurt my ability to proc pearls, but the other morph of this skill is also totally fine, just kind of comes down to personal preference. Next we have Energy Orb, a slow-moving but very good AoE heal that can really contribute during a heal check, and of course the synergy for this is even better, which will restore a pretty good amount of Magicka or stamina, making it really useful to throw at your tanks. Next is Radiating Regeneration, a fantastic heal over time skill that will help keep our teammates topped off and be our main way of continuously proccing spell power cure. Since SPC relies on overhealing, pretty much every tick of this ideally should be refreshing the major courage buff, which will give the team a pretty large damage increase. Okay, and for our first ultimate, we have Soul Harvest. So this is a skill that we are never going to cast. The main reason we have it slotted is for the Hemorrhage passive, which will grant your teammates minor savagery whenever you deal critical damage. On our Destruction Staff back bar, we are going to start with Siphoning Attacks. This is a fantastic sustain skill that will help keep you alive and have a stronger control over your resources. It also procs the transfer passive as well, so it's a nice skill to have for that as well. Next is Elemental Blockade, another very, very common healer skill that we'll see. The main reason that we're almost always going to have this on our back bar is so that we can proc our back bar enchantments. There's also the chance that it applies an elemental debuff to the enemy as well, so that's pretty nice. Next is Overflowing Altar, and this skill will apply minor lifesteal to all enemies in its pretty generous range, and it essentially acts as another small little heal over time for your team. Of course, though, the main reason that most people run this is for the synergy, which is fantastic for tanks, helping them restore 65% of their max health. Oh, and one last thing to mention with Overflowing Altar, like we mentioned in the previous video, only one healer needs to actually have this slotted at a time, so just, coordinate with your fellow healer to see if, maybe you or the other one wants to run a different skill. Next is Refreshing Path, a very strong AoE heal that also gives your allies minor intellect and minor endurance while they're standing in it and for a few seconds after they leave it. And one of the biggest reasons that it is one of my personal favorite skills in the game is that it also grants major expedition, giving your teammates lots of zoomies, making it ideal for speedrunning. Next is Echoing Vigor, another fantastic heal over time skill that costs stamina instead of magicka. This skill, like Radiating Regeneration, will help keep our teammates topped off and contribute to major courage uptime. And finally, our back bar ultimate, Aggressive Warhorn. Probably never saw this one coming. When you cast this ability, all teammates in a pretty generous range will receive a 10% increase to their max magicka and stamina for 30 seconds, as well as gaining major force, which increases critical damage by 20% for 10 seconds. It is the quintessential healer ultimate. Pretty much every healer build's going to recommend it, and for very good reason, as you can tell. So make sure you got it slotted. And finally, we will talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. Some of the setup will be a bit more complex from previous builds, and we are going to assume again that you've got a good bit of prior knowledge, so just bear with me. For our front bar set, quote unquote, air quotes there, you're going to want 3 body pieces and a restoration staff of spell power cure. Found in the White Gold Tower dungeon, this is the set that will give your teammates major courage whenever you overheal them, which gives you and your allies a pretty hefty weapon and spell damage buff. The weight will of course be light because this set is only available in light. For the enchantments, we'll want all max magicka for the extra sustain and scaling. For the traits, we'll want divines, which will increase our Mundus Stone effectiveness. Like we've mentioned in previous videos, I am also partial to using the infused trait on the large body pieces, meaning the pieces that have a higher defense and enchantment scaling. When it comes to the restoration staff, you'll want the powered trait for higher healing and any enchantment you want. I tend to use either Absorb Magicka or Berserker, but pretty much anything is totally fine. For our back bar set, air quotes again, or in this case, your destruction staff, rings, and 2 body pieces, you'll want Pillager's Prophet. Found in the Dreadsail Reef trial, this set will provide your allies with a generous amount of ult charge whenever you cast your ultimate. The amount you give them depends on how much charge you have whenever you cast your own ult, so ideally we'll want to try to hit maximum ult charge before we pop our own. For our jewelry, we'll want the Arcane trait to increase our max Magicka, and enchantment can be spell damage. However, if you're ideally on a Nightblade, I would recommend considering the potion cooldown enchantment for your jewelry. As a Nightblade, one of your passives will give you some ultimate whenever you drink a potion, so being able to drink them faster will only further your ultimate generation. Our destruction staff will want to have the infused trait with the crushing or weakening enchantment. Element isn't super important, but I've got a video on the channel covering that in depth if you are curious. Next, we'll move on to our 2-piece monster set. For this build, I like to use Symphony of Blades, which can be found in the Vet Depths of Malatar dungeon. This set will restore Magicka and stamina to someone you heal whenever they're running low on their highest maximum resource. For the weight, I like to go with 1 medium and 1 heavy for the Undaunted passive. Finally, we have our arena weapon or mythic item, and the main item that we'll need for this build to work is the Pearls of Elnafay Mythic Necklace. This is found through acquiring and scrying the appropriate leads, and it gives you 3 ult charge every time you cast a healing ability while below 50% of your highest maximum resource. It doesn't seem like much, but if you can consistently keep your Magicka below 50%, you will get a lot of ult very, very quickly. Lately, I've been getting a lot of requests to do a PvP healing video, and I really appreciate you guys asking for that. I've always said I'm not really a PvP guy, but then I sat back and I thought, you know what? Let's fix that. So I spent some time researching and working on becoming a better PvP healer to bring you guys a real PvP healing build. I mean, after all, they don't call me Doc for nothing. So let's get into this and start by talking about the basics of the build. When it comes to PvP, healing will look significantly different than PvE. Firstly, PvP support combines both the tank and the healer role. As a healer, enemies can and will attempt to focus you down early on in team fights. This is why you'll need plenty of health and armor to make sure that you can survive being attacked by several players at the same time. Also, when it comes to PvP healing itself, defensive buffs and raw healing are generally going to take precedence over offensive buffs. If you have a group that you run with that's already good at keeping themselves alive, offensive buffs are great. But in this build, we will assume that you're being matched with random teammates who do in fact need your help. So, all in all, the point of this build is to stay alive and keep your friends alive while you're at it. As usual, I'll go more in depth as we go along, but let's start by talking about our race and class. For race, as I'm sure my regulars know, I do always use the Breton. They have fantastic sustain, and that spell resistance can really come in handy in a PvP setting. Though, I will be completely honest and tell you that pretty much every race will get you some sort of benefit. While Magicka is important in PvP healing, so is your health, stamina, and defenses as well. Nearly every race in the game gives some sort of benefit to one of these or the other, so honestly, the choice is totally yours, because pretty much every race provides something of value for PvP. For my class, I'm using my Warden. You can use this build on any class, totally up to you, but the Warden's defensive buffs are so strong that I would say they're probably going to be able to utilize this build better than the other classes. For our attributes, you'll be putting all 64 points into your health, actually. While losing out on that max Magicka may hurt your healing output, a dead healer isn't healing anyone, so a high health pool will keep you on your feet. For Armundus, I like to use the Ritual for a higher healing output. If you find that you're having a hard time sustaining yourself, you can always use the Atronach for Magicka recovery or the Serpent for stamina recovery. For our food, I use the Bewitch Sugar Skulls. It increases our max health, magicka, and stamina, as well as increasing our health recovery. Having those extra resources can really be the difference between life or death, and that health recovery is nothing to scoff at either. It's pretty cheap and easy to acquire via guild traders, but it can be a little bit pricey to make, so just bear that in mind if you're recreating this build. For potions, I like to use Tri-Restoration potions. Getting a big boost to all your resources with the single push of a button is very nice. These can be a little expensive to purchase or craft, so like with our food, just keep that in mind if you're going to be using these quite a bit. Now, ordinarily, this is where I'd go in depth about the various champion points you should have slotted. The thing about PvP, though, is that a lot of PvP instances like Battlegrounds and no proc settings will have champion points disabled. Since this build is geared a bit more for Battlegrounds than anything else, I don't really have a whole lot to say about champion points. If you're someone taking this build into a standard Cyrodiil or Imperial City campaign, I'd recommend just taking some sort of combination of CPs that will increase either your healing output or your defenses. Here's a picture of just how I have mine set up, but also keep in mind that this is basically just copied over from my PvE build, so I imagine you can probably optimize this a bit more. For a very well-rounded build, you'll want your blue CP tree focused on healing and your red CP tree focused on defenses. I typically play solo queue Battlegrounds, but if you run with a group fairly often, you'll be able to tell pretty quickly what your team needs or what they don't need, or what you need or what you don't need. So if you have any specific questions about champion points, feel free to ask and I can give you a more individualized response. But for now, that's enough about champion points. Let's move on to skills. Like I always mention, this build will assume you're on a Warden. If you're not using this build on a Warden, just make sure to swap out your class skills with something else. So, on your front bar restoration staff, you will have Echoing Vigor. This is a great, long-lasting heal over time that can be found in the Assault skill line. I will say though, while the healing itself is definitely worth bringing this, I would be careful about spamming it, as it does cost stamina and will need stamina for things like blocking and dodging. If you feel like you're having a hard time managing your stamina because of this skill, feel free to trade it out. Next is Combat Prayer. This is a great group spammable heal found in the Restoration staff line that also gives a small damage and defensive buff. While the actual heal isn't quite as strong as some of the other class spammables, I find that the buffs that it gives and its ability to hit several people at once can really turn the tide of battle in your favor, especially if you've got a larger team. Next we have Healing Springs. This is a great Restoration staff AoE heal that can also give you some extra magicka recovery. While I normally say that the Illustrious Healing Morph is also totally viable here, I do feel like Springs is a little bit stronger in PvP because I very rarely see a fight in the same spot that could last the entire duration of Illustrious Healing. The reduction in time plus the recovery from Healing Springs does make it a little bit better, in my humble opinion. Next is Overflowing Altar. This Undaunted skill is a great way to apply minor lifesteal to a massive group of enemies. This also means that even teammates who you may not be able to see or reach can still at least get some healing. The synergy is also very nice as well. Next we have Radiating Regeneration, and this will be our main heal over time skill. Found in the Restoration staff line, this gives us and our team a ton of healing. On top of that, this skill is actually crucial for a couple set pieces that I'll explain more about whenever we get to that section. And for our first ultimate, we have Life Giver. This ultimate, found in the Restoration staff line, is a fantastic uh-oh button to get yourself or a teammate out of a sticky situation. While ideally, you'll be able to save up enough ult charge for the other ult found in this build, Life Giver is extremely cheap, so the option is always there if you need it. And now for our Sword and Board back bar. Our first skill is Expansive Frost Cloak. This Winter's Embrace skill will grant major resolve to us and our allies in a pretty large radius, giving us a huge defensive boost. While it doesn't actually do any healing, the protection that this skill provides can make a massive difference for you and your team. Next is Deceptive Predator. This animal companion skill will be our main way of escaping. It'll grant us increased movement speed and snare immunity for a brief period. Sometimes, a fight will be lost or just not worth committing to, and you'll need a way of escaping. This will make sure that you can retreat from a fight when needed so you can regroup with your team. Next up, we have Budding Seeds, an excellent AoE heal with a burst and a unique synergy. This green balance skill is a fantastic way to keep both you and your team alive. It's an extremely versatile heal that can be great for literally any scenario you find yourself in. Next is Blue Betty, and this adorable little animal companion skill may not seem like much on the surface, but there are so many great things about this skill, honestly. It gives you a boost to your magicka recovery, it gives you major brutality and sorcery, it cleanses negative effects, and if there's no negative effects to cleanse, you get even more weapon and spell damage. This means that this skill gives you a cleanse, an increase to your healing, and a magicka recovery boost all in a single skill. Seriously guys, I cannot recommend this thing enough. Next is Polar Wind. And this Winter's Embrace skill is another uh-oh button, but it's actually meant more for us than for anyone else. Yes, the extra little heal it gives to an ally is certainly nice, but this is a great selfish survival tool to use whenever you're stuck in a bad situation, as it gives you both a burst heal and a heal over time in a single skill. And finally, we have Healing Thicket. Our other ultimate found in the green balance skill line is another example of a great burst heal plus a heal over time in one skill. While the radius isn't huge, it's super obvious when this thing is on the ground, and I find that teammates do a pretty good job of flocking over to it, and if for whatever reason you get knocked out of the ring, you'll still get some heal over time ticks for a while after you leave it, making this a great thing to drop on choke points for your buddies. Finally, we will talk about our sets, traits, and enchantments. I'm going to do this a little bit differently than I normally do in my other build videos because there's a lot of mixing and matching going on in this one. So I'm going to first start by talking about the sets we'll be utilizing, and then I'll just kind of show you an overview of my build to show you how it looks in practice. So, what sets will we be using? Well, we're going to start by talking about our monster set, Ozazen the Inferno. Found in the Scrivener's Hall dungeon, this is a fantastic defensive set. Overhealing you or a teammate will grant an increase to armor, and healing yourself or a teammate will grant minor vitality, which will increase the amount of healing taken by that target. I absolutely love this set for both PvE and PvP. And while there may be better monster sets for certain builds and scenarios, Ozazen is a very reliable set that's good on pretty much any build for any PvP setting. For our first 5-piece set, we've got Mark of the Pariah. This can be found in the Hrothgar Overland, making it very easy to farm, and it'll act as our selfish protection set that offers us a lot of self-sustain. It's a dynamic heavy armor that can add up to around 10,000 armor based on your missing health. While an extra 10k armor may seem like a bit overkill, you also got to remember the amount of debuffs you're going to be hit with. Having that extra armor has saved my life many times. For our other 5-piece set, we've got the Robes of Transmutation. You can purchase this set in Cyrodiil using Alliance points, or you can buy it from guild traders. It'll act as our support set, and the way this works is healing you or an ally with a heal over time spell will grant the target a pretty large amount of crit resistance. Between Radiating Regeneration and Echoing Vigor, you should have no problem maintaining a very high uptime on this set. And lastly, before we move on to the build overview, we'll talk about the arena weapon we're using. While there are many great mythics and arena weapons you could choose here, I personally enjoy using the Perfected Maelstrom Restoration Staff. Otherwise known as Precise Regeneration, this weapon found from the Maelstrom Arena makes it so that every time our Radiating Regeneration spell gets a critical tick, we restore magicka. It's a fantastic sustained tool, and using this will make sure you have plenty of magicka to keep you and your teammates alive. And finally, let's take a look at how we'll place those sets, as well as the weights, enchantments, and traits of all of our gear. Starting from the top, we've got Ozazen, with our head being heavy and our shoulders being medium. You can actually see that for the traits, I've got Divines and the enchantments are magicka. That's because this is actually my PvE monster set that I use in my Rojo build. At first, I was worried that I'd be losing out on too much health and armor, but honestly, the extra healing and magicka has really started to grow on me, and I think it's a nice little boost to keep my teammates alive. You can absolutely change it to replicate the rest of the body pieces if you want, but personally, I'm going to keep those traits and enchantments there. Speaking of body pieces, let's talk about those next. As you can see, it's a combination of Mark of the Pariah and Robes of Transmutation. I've got Pariah for our chest, legs, and feet, since Pariah is heavy and that will be good for our armor. Most discourse I've seen online says that around 3 to 4 pieces of heavy is the best way to go. I went for 4 just to be safe, but you can always go for 3 if you feel like, you're not having any issues. Then my belt and hands are going to be Transmutation, and both of those are light. I've got the Reinforced trait on my heavy armor, and the Impenetrable trait on my light armor. For enchantments, everything is Prismatic Defense, which will increase our max magicka, health, and stamina. For our jewelry, I've got Pariah rings and Transmutation necklace. All of the traits will be Triune, and then my rings have the Prismatic cost reduction, which will reduce the magicka, health, and stamina cost of skills. Since we've got a couple skills that use health or stamina as well as our magicka skills, I personally feel like the cost reduction is worth it. For our necklace, I've got Prismatic Recovery, which will give a small boost to our health, magicka, and stamina recovery. And finally, we're on to our weapons. For our Restoration Staff, I've got the Powered trait for extra healing and the Absorb Magicka enchantment. Honestly, the enchantment isn't really super important. I just like that little bit of extra magicka. If you prefer something else, hey, please feel free to use it. Then on the back bar for our mace, you don't have to use a mace, I just like it for thematic purposes. I've got the Powered trait for extra healing and the Hardened enchantment. Again, the enchantment isn't important, that's just what came on it by default, so I left it. On our shield, I've got the Sturdy trait to block a little more damage, and the Glyph of Prismatic Defense trait for another small boost to our health, magicka, and stamina. And there we have it. When it's all said and done, if you copied my build exactly, your stats and gameplay should look relatively similar to this. Now, like I always mention, I do not have the final word on PvP healing. There are definitely ways I think you could probably optimize this build more, and I welcome you to do so. I just figured I would share this as I think it's a pretty solid build for your average PvP healer, and I'm working on becoming better when it comes to PvP so that I can maybe put out more guides for you guys. A popular way for people to make the Elder Scrolls Online more accessible for all kinds of players is through the use of one-bar builds. These builds will use the Oaken Soul Mythic Ring to eliminate the need for bar swapping. While it does have the amount of skills that you can have at your disposal, it does give you plenty of permanent buffs to make up for it. Typically, we see one-bar builds delegated to heavy attack setups for group DPS or solo players, but tanks and healers can also make use of one-bar builds to simplify their rotation. My name's Doc, your host for all things healing, and in this video, I'll be creating a one-bar build for my fellow healers. Real quick though, one thing I want to preface before we actually get into the build is that, objectively speaking, one-bar builds will be a bit weaker than their two-bar counterparts. It's not to say that one-bar builds cannot be successful, because I do believe that this build is totally viable for the vast majority of content, but more so just to say that my suggestion would be to use this build as a stepping stone to work your way up to two-bar healing, if that is something that's possible for you. Okay, with that being said, let's go ahead and get into the actual build. So, with this being a one-bar build, we will miss out on some buffs and debuffs for both ourselves and our teammates. So, the goal of this build is to maintain as many of our standard buffs and debuffs while also simplifying our rotation for the highest possible uptime we can get on both our skills and our sets. The main ways we'll be doing this is through our sets Spell Power Cure and Powerful Assault. These are great support sets that can provide constant, easy-to-apply damage buffs to our teammates. Also, they're both fairly easy to acquire. You may just have to drop a little gold to get Powerful Assault. Then with our skills, we'll be trying our best to have as many synergies and important buffs as we can. Of course, I'll explain much more in depth as we go along. For now, let's talk about our race and preferred class. So, as always, I personally enjoy using Bretons for the extra sustain that they get from their passives. However, with this build only using half of the skills and plenty of time for heavy attacks, sustain won't be too much of an issue, so it may be worth it to use a race like Argonians for the extra healing. When it comes to class, it really doesn't matter. You can use this build on literally any class, but For the purposes of this video, I'll be using the Warden. The main reason is that, firstly, they're the best healing class in the game, but the other reason is that their class buff, Minor Toughness, is activated simply by healing someone. Unlike some other classes such as Templars or Nightblades, you don't need a dedicated skill for applying your class buff, so that's one less buff that we have to worry about finding space for. For our attributes, as always, we'll want all 64 points into Magicka for that sweet increase to our healing. For our Mundus, I recommend using the Ritual for the extra healing. Since we'll be down a few skills, the extra healing could certainly make a difference in the long run. When it comes to food, I'd say anything that affects our max Magicka will be preferred. For this build, I actually ran the Jugged Rabbit Preserves. It's really cheap and easy to make, while also giving us a pretty large boost to our max health, Magicka, and stamina. This means that our heals will be stronger and will be a bit tougher to put down. For potions, it doesn't really matter, honestly. I think some spell damage potions would be great for a little boost to our healing numbers, though, like I said, honestly, whatever potion you want to use is totally fine. And now on to our champion points. If you've seen any previous build video that I've made, these will pretty much be unchanged, but we'll go over them anyway. So firstly, we're going to start off with From the Brink. If you or a party member happens to fall below 25% health, this little perk will grant them a huge damage shield when you heal them. This can be great for clutch saves if someone is about to go down. Next is Soothing Tide, and this will increase the amount of healing that our AoE heals do. Since we'll pretty much always have some sort of AoE heal up, this will be very nice to have. Next is Swift Renewal. This will increase the amount of healing that our heal over time effects do, and much like our AoE heal, the idea is that we'll have a couple of heal over times up pretty much the entire time. And lastly is Enlivening Overflow. Overhealing someone will grant them some extra recovery, and since we probably aren't going to be able to give our teammates intellect and endurance with this build, the next best way of giving our teammates a little boost to sustain is through Enlivening Overflow. Okay, so that was our blue champion points. Now on to our red champion points. Firstly, we're going to start with Boundless Vitality. This will give us a little boost to our survivability by giving us some extra health. It becomes even better since we're using a Warden, and our heals will give us even more additional health. Next is Fortified, another little boost to our survivability by giving us some extra armor. It never hurts to, be a little harder to take down. Next is Rejuvenation, and this gives us some extra Magicka, stamina, and health recovery. While sustain won't be much of an issue in this build, I still think the extra bonus is nice. And finally, we have Spirit Mastery. Now, ordinarily, healers won't be the ones going for revives, but this build is uniquely equipped to do so. With us only having one bar of skills to worry about, we can very easily get every heal over time, AoE heal down, everything that we need, and then revive someone before any of those skills actually run out. Speaking of skills, let's talk about those next. Like we mentioned in all our build videos, this build will assume you're a Warden. If you are not a Warden, then just any class skills that you happen to see, feel free to swap those out for some skills from your own class. So, what skills are we going to be using? Well, to start out, we are going to be using Echoing Vigor. It's an awesome heal over time skill in its own right, but the main reason that we'll be using this Assault Line skill is that this will be our main way that we activate the powerful Assault set. I'll explain a bit more whenever we get into the sets, but know that you'll be casting this pretty often. Next is Combat Prayer. This is our main burst heal, as well as providing a good amount of buffs. This Restoration Staff skill is one of the best tools in a healer's arsenal. There's a reason that this is such a staple skill on nearly every healer build. Next is Budding Seeds. This will be our main AoE heal, and it's a great one at that. On top of being an AoE heal, it's also a burst heal and offers a unique synergy, all in one single skill. This is a great way to keep our teammates topped off. Next is Energy Orb, a very strong AoE heal from the Undaunted line that can also provide a great synergy to restore some resources. Whether it's a heal check or throwing it at a tank, this is a very versatile tool for healers. Next is Radiating Regeneration. Our other fantastic heal over time, this Restoration Staff skill will contribute towards keeping our teammates topped off as well as keeping a very high uptime on Spell Power Cure's Major Courage buff. And finally, for our ultimate, we will be using Aggressive Warhorn. Arguably the best support ultimate in the game, this Assault Line ultimate will give your team both a buff to their max resources as well as a substantial damage buff via Major Force for 20 full seconds. And that's it for skills. Since we only have one bar, we only had one bar's worth of skills to cover. So lastly, let's go over our sets, traits, and enchantments. For our body pieces, or in other words, our chest, hands, legs, belt, and shoes, we'll want Spell Power Cure. If you've been around the channel for a while, or even just been a healer in ESO for a while, you'll know that Spell Power Cure is a staple set for healers. Found in the White Gold Tower dungeon, this set will grant you and your party Major Courage, giving y'all a hefty amount of weapon and spell damage anytime you overheal them. The weight will be all light, and the enchantments will be Max Magicka for extra scaling and sustain, and the trait will be Divines for the Mundus Stone boost. I will say though, like I always like to mention, I also enjoy running the Infused trait on the big armor pieces, or in other words, the pieces that have a bigger enchantment bonus on them. For our quote-unquote back bar, but it's actually our Restoration Staff, shoulders, one ring, and necklace, trust me, it'll make sense, you'll want to use Powerful Assault. I know the placements of those things seem a little weird, but with Oaken Soul taking up one of our ring spots and us not having a back bar, we gotta get a little creative, so feel free to just copy those placements. Purchasable in the Imperial City for Telvar or in Guild Traders for gold, Powerful Assault will grant you a unique damage buff whenever you cast a skill from the Assault skill line, or, in our case, Echoing Vigor. The damage buff it grants isn't incredibly strong, but it is unique, meaning it can stack with any named damage buffs such as Major Courage from Spell Power Cure. For the jewelry, you'll want the Arcane trait for extra Magicka, and you can use either spell damage or Magicka recovery for the enchantment, or even a combination of the two. For our Restoration Staff, you'll want the Powered trait for the extra healing, and I tend to use either the Absorb Magicka enchantment or the Weapon Damage enchantment, but I mean, honestly, you can just kind of use whatever enchantment you want. And this seems like as good a place as any to talk about our mythic item, the Oaken Soul Ring. Like we've mentioned previously, this will take up one of your ring spots, and it will make it so that we can't bar swap while giving us a ton of permanent buffs. You can find this through the Antiquity system, and I'd recommend just looking up a guide to see exactly where all the leads are. Honestly, they weren't too hard to grind out. I think I was able to get them all in under a day, if you've got like a weekend off or whatever. The trait and enchantment suggestions will be the same as the Powerful Assault jewelry. And finally, this is normally where I'd talk about our monster set, but with this build, we actually won't be able to have a full monster set. Since Powerful Assault is taking up our shoulder spot, this build will just have one piece of the monster set, meaning we'll only be paying attention to the first line when choosing our item here. The most common recommendation that people will talk about for healers is Magma Incarnate. You could also talk about Slime Craw as well, since they both give fantastic bonuses. Truthfully, I don't think it matters that much. I just threw on one piece of Symphony of Blade since I already had it available on this character. It gives us some extra healing, so that's nice. Ozazen also gives a decent bonus with some extra Magicka recovery if you feel like you need it and you happen to have that one on you already. Which one you choose kind of just comes down to your personal preference and what you feel like the build may still be missing a little bit of. Trait and enchantment recommendations will be the same as the rest of the armor. In terms of weight, we'll want this helmet to be heavy. Since we have a piece of Powerful Assault in our shoulder spot, like we mentioned, and that is medium, having our monster helmet be heavy will give us the full Undaunted passive bonus. Okay, and I do believe that should be it for the 1-bar healer build. And that was all the pure class healer builds that I wanted to share with you guys today. If and when you feel ready to dive into the world of subclassing, make sure to come back here so you can watch those videos too. Don't forget to check out the link in the description so you can follow me on stuff and join my Discord server. Before we head out, I also want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters Tyler Scott, Dylan Stewart, and Sharnee Lee. as well as my YouTube members King Gingy, Durgy, insert username, Eric from Ohio, Timeburn, and Malcolm Ewing. Thank you guys for your continued support, and I appreciate it. I think all I've got left to say is that I've been Doc. Take care of yourselves, be good to others. Thank you again for 3,000 subscribers, and I will catch y'all in the next one.